On our last episode, we discussed the life and death of Alexander the Great. Hello, I'm Knight Jake, and welcome to our Bible Wars bonus series, Maccabees with Red Fist Raw.
Alexandros Megas. We translate it, Alexander the Great. Thing is, he conquers the entire known world. He just demolishes ancient Persia, which had been these guys ruled everything. Demolishes them. And just at the point where he's ready to set up a kingdom for himself, well, again, First Maccabees tells it this way, he fell sick and perceived that he was dying. He's like in his 20s when this happens. Chapter 1, verse 6 says, so he summoned his most honored officers. It's like they come to him and they know that something's going to happen here. And they've just conquered the world. And so they're like, hey, Alexander, like before you die, can you tell us which one of us is going to be in charge? Yeah, you don't have an heir, quite. I think there was a baby at the time. You don't have a real heir. Put one of us in charge. To who, Alexander? Megas. To whom goes your empire? And he responds, through his dying breaths, to the strongest. Now, whether or not he actually said that, what happened next was exactly that. All of his generals, all of his, leading officers, they go to war with each other immediately. And there's a great story in all of that. Intrigue and deception and assassinations, and it's all about who can keep Alexander's body. It ends up in a gold-plated tomb in Egypt eventually, but the man's back and forth stealing his body because you're trying to prove that you have his authority. And this is like near that era where the rise of the God King is part of Greek culture, Greco-Roman culture. It was there in Egypt before, but it wasn't there but in Greco-Roman culture. They didn't really believe in kings, come to think of it. But anyhow, it all eventually settles down with 4 different empires. There are 4 different generals, if we can call them that, who end up establishing a foothold that is able to leave a dynasty, where their inheritors, their children, are able to rule after them. And of these 4, there's really only 2. I mean, there are 2 others. There's the Attalids and there's the Antigonians, who effectively, though, they just rule cities, more or less. The Attalid Empire is Pergamum and Thrace, and they're a tributary to one of the other empires. That is, they have to pay one of the other empires, and the same can be said for the Antigonid Empire. Macedonia is what they get, and that's the homeland. Yeah, kind of, but it ain't Egypt, right? The 2 groups that are really the dynasties that end up being sort of subtle or half empires comparable to Persia are the Ptolemaic Empire, named after Ptolemy, which ends up controlling Egypt, which is always been a vast wealth because of the Nile River Delta and the value that brings to human civilization. And then you have the Seleucid Empire, under Seleucus, or Seleucus, however you want to pronounce it, who rules Mesopotamia and Asia. So these 2 kind of east and west empires. And knowing about these, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, are the first step, really, in beginning to make heads or tails of Daniel chapter 11, which is all about the kings of the south and the north. 2 kings who are in a constant war with each other over ultimate power, which itself flows out of what we were just talking about, actually being prophesied in Daniel chapter 8, with the vision of the ram and the goat, where Daniel, living in Babylon, standing upon the Ulai Canal, raises his eyes and sees a ram standing on the bank of the canal with 2 horns, and the horns were high. No beast could stand before him, and there was none who could rescue from his power. And man, they were dominant. Cyrus, Darius, and Xerxes, dominant. He did as he pleased and became great. This is Persia. But as Daniel is considering him, a male goat comes from the west across the face of the entire earth without touching the ground as he goes. He's got a conspicuous single horn, which most animals don't do, right? Unicorns, yeah? It means he's unparalleled. There's none like him, ever before or ever again. Comes to the ram with 2 horns, the one that's standing on the bank of the canal, and he rams into him with all of his wrath. And he struck the ram, and he broke his 2 horns, and the ram had no power to stand before him. He was cast to the ground and trampled. There was none who could rescue. And the goat became exceedingly great. Well, that's Alexander. That's Greece. But then his great horn was broken, and instead there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. Hey, you know who that is now, don't you? That's Ptolemy, Seleucus, Lysimachus, who's the Attalid Empire, and Antigonus, the generals of Alexander, who managed to establish empires and dynasties of their own. And verse 9 says, out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. That's Israel. It grew great even to the host of heaven, and some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled them. Now, you might think that's about the devil, and in a sense it really is, but no, this is about a man in history, which is all about what the Maccabees is going to be talking about. As verse 11 prophesies that the regular burnt offering was taken away. And that'll come up again. And his sanctuary was overthrown. That'll come up again. And the host will be given over together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression, thrown to the ground, and making desolate the sanctuary to be trampled underfoot until it is restored to its rightful state. Now, I'm summarizing quite a bit of text there. Now, the rest of the chapter goes on to explain this more or less, but it doesn't, because from our point of view, you might think it's going to talk about Rome, but it's not. It has nothing to do with Rome. It has everything to do with that intertestamental time and the rise of one of the greatest mad kings of that intertestamental time, and what he does that sets into place the history that's going to lead us directly to the type of Bethlehem and Jerusalem we find when Jesus is born. And Daniel prays for his people in chapter 9, and he has another vision in chapter 10. But in chapter 11, it comes back, this war between these two of the four generals of Alexander. Beginning in chapter 3 by talking about Alexander, a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do as he wills. And as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the four winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, that is, not to his own kids, right? Not according to the authority with which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to others besides these. Then the king of the south shall be strong, but one of his princes shall be greater than he, and shall rule with great authority. And then it goes on to talk a little bit more about some of these things. But first, king of the south. What's south? If you got Macedonia, you got Pergamum, you got Mesopotamia, and you got Egypt. What's south? Egypt. And it goes on to say how initially the south's going to triumph against the north. It's going to conquer the north. That's Mesopotamia. That's the Seleucids. It's going to initially the Ptolemaic Empire is going to be the strongest. The Seleucid will be the weaker. But see, things are going to invert. Verse 13, for the king of the north shall again raise a multitude greater than the first, and after some years he shall come on with a great army and abundant supplies. In those times many shall rise against the king of the south. The king of the north shall come and throw up siege works in a well-fortified city. And the forces of the south shall not stand, even his best troops. And afterward he shall turn his face to the coastlands. But the commander shall put an end to his insolence. Indeed, his insolence shall be turned back on him, and he shall flee to the fortresses of his own land. Now, to get this, and what this is really saying here, you got to understand first that the king of the north and the king of the south are dynasties. They're not individuals at this point. So it's things that are happening through more than one person in the lineage of the man, Ptolemy or Seleucus. So if you let that happen, you can actually track a lot of what's been said there. You can piece it to various guys in those dynasties, particularly then. When the king of the north gets his feet back under him, the son of the son of the son who actually is able to go down and conquer or push back Egypt, he's a guy named Antiochus the Great. And he gets the groove back for the Seleucid Empire and pushes not only toward Egypt, but especially into Syria. Right, so the middle land between Egypt and Mesopotamia, guess what's right there, by the way? Judea as well. He pushes into that direction, and he basically takes Syria, and Judea's kind of squished in there. Kind of both sides can wage war for it. And this is an old history and even a recent history, right, of ideologies waging war over a little tiny strip of land that kind of meets the two empires or the two ideologies in the middle. But none of that's really what's important here. What's important is then when he dies, this Antiochus the Great, Verse 20, chapter 11, then shall arise in his place another guy who shall be broken. This is his firstborn son who ends up getting himself killed. And in his place, verse 21, shall arise a contemptible person to whom royal majesty has not been given. He shall come without warning, obtain the kingdom by flattery, stir up his power and his heart against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall wage war, but he shall not stand. Which is what happened when Antiochus IV, second-born son of Antiochus the Great, conquered the Ptolemaic Empire in Egypt. But here's the other thing. So by this time, Rome is a thing. Rome, in fact, thinks all of this area really belongs to them ultimately. It's an uneasy balance. They haven't, I don't think, quite conquered it, but they are tributaries of Rome. And you don't want to fight Rome. Rome beats everybody they fight against. Nobody has a chance. And so when he does conquer Ptolemy, he leaves him on the throne sort of with an agreement. You're going to pay me some money every year, right? But I'm really in charge, but you keep being king down there. It's cool. It's cool as long as I get my cash. So what happens next? Daniel goes on. And he shall return to his land with a great wealth, but his heart shall be set against the holy covenant. Maccabees 1 says it this way, in chapter 1, verse 10. From them came forth a sinful root. When Antiochus saw that his kingdom was established, he determined to become king of the land of Egypt, that he might reign over both kingdoms. He engaged King Ptolemy of Egypt in battle, and Ptolemy turned and fled before him, and they captured the fortified cities.
Thank you for watching this bonus episode of Bible Wars. If you've enjoyed this series or any of the other work of the Order of Knight George, you can support us over at Patreon. I would also encourage you to go over and support Reverend Jonathan Fisk at Patreon. Goodbye, and God bless.